2014, Theranos was the hottest startup in Silicon Valley. The company's founder, Elizabeth Holmes, appeared on magazine covers as the next Steve Jobs, wearing black turtlenecks and promising to revolutionize healthcare. She claimed her technology could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood taken from a finger prick. No needles, no vials, just a tiny sample analyzed by a proprietary machine called the Edison. The implications were staggering. Cheaper, faster, more accessible blood tests could transform medicine. Patients could monitor their health continuously. Doctors could diagnose diseases earlier. Healthcare costs could plummet. Investors believed every word. Theranos raised over $700 million from some of the most sophisticated investors in the world. At its peak, the company was valued at $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes personally owned half, making her the youngest self-made female billionaire in history at age 30. But there was a problem. The technology didn't work. It had never worked. The company wasn't revolutionizing medicine. It was perpetrating one of the largest frauds in Silicon Valley history. This is the story of how a 19-year-old Stanford dropout convinced the world she had invented something that didn't exist, and how the lie unraveled with devastating consequences. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born on February 3, 1984, in Washington, D.C. Her father, Christian Holmes, worked for government agencies, including USAID. Her mother, Noel Daoust, was a congressional committee staffer. Elizabeth grew up in a well-educated, upper-middle-class family with connections to political and business elites. As a child, she was described as intensely ambitious and unusually serious. She wrote in a letter to her father at age 9 that she wanted to discover something new, something that would help people. Friends later recalled that even as a teenager, Elizabeth talked about wanting to be a billionaire. She wasn't interested in money for luxury. She wanted the recognition, the validation, the sense that she had changed the world in a fundamental way. Elizabeth enrolled at Stanford University in 2002, intending to study chemical engineering. She was driven, intense, and relentlessly focused on achievement. During her freshman year, she worked in a lab that researched new drug delivery systems through skin patches. The experience introduced her to the world of medical devices and diagnostics. In the summer after her freshman year, Elizabeth traveled to Singapore for a Stanford program. There, she worked at the Genome Institute of Singapore, which was involved in researching infectious diseases like SARS. It was during this period that Elizabeth conceived the idea that would define her life. What if blood tests could be done using just a tiny sample, a few drops from a finger prick, rather than multiple vials drawn from veins? The idea wasn't entirely new. Researchers had been trying to miniaturize blood testing for years. But Elizabeth became convinced she could make it work at a scale and accuracy that would revolutionize the industry. In 2003, at age 19, Elizabeth made a decision that would become central to her mythology. She dropped out of Stanford. Like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Mark Zuckerberg before her, she left an elite university to pursue her vision. Her parents were initially resistant, but eventually provided financial support. Elizabeth used her tuition money to fund the startup she named Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. The name suggested a company that could both diagnose disease and guide treatment, a bold claim for a 19-year-old with no medical degree, no business experience, and no team. Elizabeth's first major break came through a family connection. Her father knew Channing Robertson, a well-respected chemical engineering professor at Stanford. Robertson became Elizabeth's mentor and advisor. He was impressed by her intensity and conviction. With Robertson's endorsement, Elizabeth was able to raise initial funding. She pitched investors with a compelling story. Blood tests are painful, expensive, and inaccessible to many people. They require trained phlebotomists, specialized labs, and large sample volumes. What if a device the size of a printer could run hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood, delivering results in hours instead of days at a fraction of the cost? The vision was irresistible. Investors saw a market worth tens of billions of dollars. By 2004, Theranos had raised over $6 million, an impressive sum for a company that hadn't yet built a working product. Elizabeth hired a small team of engineers and scientists. The goal was to develop the Edison device, a miniaturized blood analyzer that could perform multiple tests simultaneously from tiny samples. But from the very beginning, there were problems. Blood testing is extraordinarily complex. Traditional tests use milliliters of blood because test accuracy depends on having sufficient sample volume. Trying to run tests on a few microliters, about 1,000th the normal volume, creates massive technical challenges. The concentrations of many molecules in blood are so low that detecting them accurately in tiny samples is nearly impossible with existing technology. Theranos' scientists struggled. The Edison device produced inconsistent, inaccurate results. Tests would give different readings from the same sample. Some readings were wildly off from known values. But Elizabeth was undeterred. She hired more engineers, pushing them to work around the clock. The culture at Theranos became intensely secretive and high pressure. Different teams worked in isolation, not allowed to share information. Elizabeth insisted on extreme confidentiality, even internally. She argued that the technology was so revolutionary, it had to be protected from competitors. But the real reason for secrecy was different. It prevented employees from realizing that the Edison didn't work. Teams working on specific components didn't know that other parts of the system were failing. The isolation hid the systemic failure. As years passed and the technology still didn't work, Elizabeth made a fateful decision. She would go to market anyway. In the early 2010s, Theranos began forming partnerships with major pharmacy chains and retailers. In 2013, Theranos announced a partnership with Walgreens to place blood testing centers, called wellness centers, in Walgreens stores across the country. Customers could walk into Walgreens, get a finger prick, and receive blood test results quickly and cheaply. Walgreens invested $140 million in the partnership. The announcement generated massive media attention. Here was a real company, with real partnerships, deploying revolutionary technology into the real world. But behind the scenes, the truth was much darker. The Edison devices weren't producing reliable results. So Theranos did something extraordinary in its audacity. They used traditional blood testing machines purchased from other companies like Siemens. They took the tiny finger prick samples, diluted them to create larger volumes, and ran them through conventional machines. They then presented the results as if they came from the Edison. In cases where even diluted samples didn't work, which was often, they drew blood from patients using traditional venipuncture, the needle in the vein method that Theranos claimed to have eliminated. The entire premise was a lie. Theranos wasn't revolutionizing blood testing. It was running a traditional lab while marketing itself as revolutionary. Worse, the results were often inaccurate. Diluting tiny samples introduces errors. Tests performed on diluted blood gave false readings. Some patients received results indicating they had diseases they didn't have diseases. Others received all-clear results when they actually had serious conditions. People made medical decisions, starting or stopping medications, based on faulty Theranos tests. The potential for harm was enormous. Yet Elizabeth pressed on. She gave interviews to major media outlets, appeared on magazine covers, spoke at conferences, all while knowing the technology didn't work. Her public persona became carefully cultivated. She wore black turtlenecks in conscious imitation of Steve Jobs. She adopted a deep, unnaturally low voice that some employees later said was fake, designed to project authority. She spoke in platitudes about changing the world, disrupting healthcare, and democratizing access to information. The media ate it up. In 2014 and 2015, Elizabeth Holmes was everywhere here. Forbes named her the youngest self-made female billionaire, with a net worth of $4.5 billion based on her ownership of Theranos. Fortune named her one of the most powerful women in business. Time included her on its list of the 100 most influential people. President Obama appointed her as a presidential ambassador for global entrepreneurship. She hobnobbed with world leaders, billionaires, and celebrities. Theranos' board of directors read like a who's who of American power. George Shultz, former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. Sam Nunn, former U.S. Senator. James Mattis, retired Marine Corps general, who would later become Secretary of Defense. These weren't tech people. They were political and military elites, lending credibility through their prestige, but possessing no expertise to evaluate the technology. How did Elizabeth fool so many smart people? The answer reveals systematic weaknesses in how investors, boards, and media evaluate startups. First, she told a compelling story. The narrative of a young Stanford dropout revolutionizing healthcare tapped into Silicon Valley's mythology. Investors want to believe they're funding the next Steve Jobs. Elizabeth looked and sounded the part. Second, she created information asymmetry. Theranos operated in extreme secrecy, refusing to publish research or allow independent validation. She argued that transparency would help competitors. Investors, dazzled by the story and the names on the board, didn't push back hard enough. Third, she exploited deference to authority. Once prestigious board members and investors like Don Lucas and Larry Ellison backed Theranos, others assumed due diligence had been done. Nobody wanted to be the skeptic who missed the next big thing. Fourth, she targeted investors outside healthcare and technology. Many of Theranos's biggest backers came from politics, media, and old money families like the Waltons and DeVoses. These investors had money and prestige, but lacked technical expertise to scrutinize the science. They invested based on Elizabeth's story and the board's credibility, not rigorous evaluation of the technology. Fifth, she used legal intimidation. Theranos's lawyers, led by the prominent David Boies, aggressively threatened anyone who questioned the company. Employees who raised concerns were silenced with lawsuits. Journalists who investigated were hit with legal threats. Whistleblowers were pursued ruthlessly. The message was clear: challenge us, and we will destroy you. But cracks began appearing. In 2015, a Wall Street Journal investigative reporter named John Carreyrou received a tip from a whistleblower. The source, a medical doctor and former Theranos lab director named Adam Clapper, along with Tyler Schultz, the grandson board member George Schultz, provided inside information. They described how Theranos was using traditional machines for most tests, how results were often inaccurate, and how the Edison device didn't work as claimed. Carreyrou spent months investigating, interviewing former employees, reviewing documents, and consulting medical experts. Theranos fought back viciously. Lawyers sent threatening letters. Elizabeth Holmes personally called the Wall Street Journal's owner, Rupert Murdoch, who was also a Theranos investor, to try to kill the story. But Carreyrou and the Journal stood firm. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's first exposé. The article revealed that Theranos was running most blood tests on traditional machines, not the Edison device. It disclosed that results were often inaccurate and that the company had misled investors and partners about its capabilities. The article was devastating. Theranos issued a furious denial, attacking Carreyrou and the Journal as biased and inaccurate. Elizabeth Holmes went on CNBC and other outlets defending the company. But the damage was done. More whistleblowers came forward. Regulatory agencies began investigating. In January 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, conducted a surprise inspection of Theranos's Newark, California lab. The findings were horrifying. The lab had major deficiencies that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. Test results were unreliable. Quality controls were inadequate. Procedures violated federal regulations. In July 2016, CMS banned Elizabeth Holmes from owning or operating a medical laboratory for 2 years. Theranos was forced to void 2 years of blood test results, meaning thousands of patients had received unreliable medical information. Walgreens terminated its partnership and sued Theranos. Lawsuits piled up from investors, partners, and patients. The company's valuation, once $9 billion, collapsed to nothing. Theranos shut down its labs and laid off most of its workforce. In September 2018, the company officially dissolved, But the legal consequences were just beginning. In June 2018, federal prosecutors indicted Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos' president and COO, Ramesh Sunny Balwani, on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The indictment alleged that Holmes and Balwani defrauded investors of hundreds of millions of dollars and defrauded doctors and patients by providing false and inaccurate blood test results. The case was closely watched as a test of whether startup founders could be held criminally accountable for lies told to investors. The trial began in September 2021 after multiple delays. Elizabeth's defense strategy centered on two arguments. First, she claimed she genuinely believed the technology would eventually work and that her statements were optimistic projections, not intentional lies. Second, she alleged that Balwani, who had also been her boyfriend, had abused and manipulated her, affecting her decision-making. The abuse claims were controversial, seen by some as a legitimate explanation of her mindset, and by others as a cynical attempt to deflect responsibility. The trial lasted 4 months. Prosecutors presented evidence of specific false statements Holmes made to investors, partners, and the media. They showed internal documents proving Holmes knew the technology didn't work as claimed. They called former employees who testified that Holmes ignored or silenced concerns. They demonstrated that Holmes personally approved misleading marketing materials and statements. On January 3, 2022, the jury returned a verdict. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts, 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors and 3 counts of wire fraud against specific investors. She was acquitted on 4 counts related to defrauding patients, likely because the jury found the evidence of intent less clear in those cases. The mixed verdict reflected the complexity of the case. In November 2022, Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She began serving her sentence in May 2023 at a minimum security federal prison camp in Texas. Ramesh Balwani was tried separately, convicted on 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy, and sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison. The fall of Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes raises profound questions about Silicon Valley culture, regulatory oversight, and the nature of fraud. On one level, this is a straightforward story of criminal fraud. Elizabeth Holmes lied to investors, partners, and patients about technology that didn't work. She knew it didn't work. She lied anyway to raise money and build her company. She put patients at risk by providing unreliable medical tests. The consequences of those lies were severe. Investors lost over $600 million. Patients made medical decisions based on faulty information. Trust in healthcare innovation was damaged. But on another level, the Theranos story reveals systematic problems in how innovation is funded and celebrated. Silicon Valley has a culture that glorifies bold vision and tolerates failure. The mantra is move fast and break things. Fail forward, fake it till you make it. In software, this approach can work. You can release a buggy product, get feedback, and iterate quickly. But in healthcare, the stakes are different. A buggy blood test can kill people. Yet the same venture capital mindset that works for software companies was applied to a medical device company, with disastrous results. Investors who would never buy a used car without an inspection invested hundreds of millions in Theranos, based on Elizabeth's story and a prestigious board, without rigorous technical due diligence. The role of the board is particularly troubling. Theranos' board was filled with famous names, but almost none had healthcare or diagnostics expertise. They were there for credibility, not oversight. They didn't ask hard questions about how the technology worked. They didn't demand independent validation. They accepted Elizabeth's claims at face value because questioning her would have meant admitting they didn't understand the science. It's a cautionary tale about the limits of general business expertise. Prestige is not a substitute for domain knowledge. The media also played a role. Journalists celebrated Elizabeth Holmes as a visionary before scrutinizing her claims. The narrative was too good to resist. Young female founder in male-dominated Silicon Valley, revolutionary technology, Steve Jobs comparisons. Media coverage created a halo effect that made it harder for skeptics to be heard. When Carreero's investigation began, Some journalists and commentators initially defended Holmes, suggesting the criticism was sexist or motivated by fear of disruption. It took overwhelming evidence to overcome the narrative. Regulatory failures also contributed. The FDA and CMS should have intervened much earlier. Theranos was performing medical tests on patients without proper validation and approval. Regulatory agencies were slow to act, partly because Theranos' legal team was skilled at exploiting regulatory gray areas, and partly because regulators were reluctant to stifle innovation. The result was years of patients receiving potentially dangerous test results before authorities stepped in. What makes Elizabeth Holmes particularly fascinating is the question of intent. Did she start as a genuine visionary who convinced herself the technology would eventually work, then got trapped in an escalating series of lies? Or was it fraud from the beginning, a calculated con? The evidence suggests a combination. Elizabeth likely believed, initially, that she could solve the technical problems. But as years passed and the problems persisted, she made a choice to proceed anyway, to fake the technology while continuing to raise money and expand. At some point, she crossed from optimistic founder to knowing fraud. Exactly when that happened is unclear, but by 2013, when she was deploying fake technology in Walgreens stores, she clearly knew. The comparison to Steve Jobs, which Elizabeth cultivated, is revealing. Jobs was a master of reality distortion, convincing people to believe in products that didn't yet exist. But Apple delivered. The iPhone worked. Theranos didn't deliver. The Edison never worked. Elizabeth had the reality distortion, but none of the substance. She had the vision and charisma, but not the engineering brilliance or team that could execute. She couldn't admit failure, so she faked success. The victims of Theranos are varied. Investors lost over $600 million, though many were wealthy enough to absorb the losses. Walgreens lost $140 million plus reputational damage. Safeway spent $350 million remodeling stores for Theranos clinics that never fully launched. Partners like the Cleveland Clinic and Capital Blue Cross ended relationships, wasting time and resources. But the most tragic victims are patients who received faulty test results. Some were told they had conditions they didn't have, causing unnecessary stress in treatment. Others missed diagnoses because Theranos tests failed to detect real problems. A woman named Brittany Gould testified that a Theranos test incorrectly indicated she was miscarrying, causing emotional trauma. While there are no confirmed cases of deaths directly caused by Theranos tests, the potential was there. Employees also suffered. Many were talented scientists and engineers who believed in the mission. They joined Theranos to change healthcare. Instead, they found themselves in a toxic, secretive environment where raising concerns led to threats and termination. Some, like Tyler Schultz, became whistleblowers at great personal cost. Tyler's decision to speak to Carrie Rue destroyed his relationship with his grandfather, George Schultz, who refused to believe Theranos was fraudulent and sided with Elizabeth until overwhelming evidence emerged. Tyler faced legal threats and spent over $400,000 on legal fees defending himself from Theranos' attacks. His courage helped expose the fraud, but the personal cost was immense. The fall of Theranos had ripples beyond the company. Venture capital became more cautious about health tech startups, making extraordinary claims. Regulatory agencies tightened oversight of diagnostics companies. Media became more skeptical of founder mythologies. The era of fake it till you make it faced new scrutiny. Elizabeth Holmes became a symbol of Silicon Valley hubris and the dangers of valuing narrative over substance. Yet the lessons are still being debated. Some argue Theranos was an outlier, a case of exceptional fraud that doesn't reflect broader problems. Others see it as emblematic of a culture that prioritizes growth, valuation, and storytelling over truth and safety. The reality is probably both. Theranos was exceptional in the scale and duration of its fraud, but the conditions that allowed it to thrive, credulous investors, celebrity board members, media hype, regulatory gaps, secrecy, legal intimidation, exist throughout Silicon Valley. Elizabeth Holmes' story ends with her in prison, her fortune gone, her reputation destroyed. The youngest self-made female billionaire became the face of startup fraud. The revolutionary technology that would change medicine never existed. The company that was valued at $9 billion dissolved worthless. The comparison to Steve Jobs, carefully cultivated, became a cruel joke. Jobs built products that worked and changed the world. Holmes built a story that fooled the world but delivered nothing. The question that haunts the Theranos saga is how it lasted so long. How did a 19-year-old dropout convince the world she had solved a problem that had stumped researchers for decades? How did she raise $700 million without ever demonstrating that the technology worked? How did she deploy fake technology into pharmacies, putting patients at risk, and maintain the charade for years? The answers lie in a perfect storm of factors, a compelling narrative, informational asymmetry, deference to authority, legal intimidation, media hype, regulatory gaps, and a culture that worships founders and distrusts skepticism. The Theranos fraud cost investors hundreds of millions, wasted partners' resources, and endangered patients' health. But perhaps its greatest cost was to trust. Trust in healthcare innovation, trust in Silicon Valley, trust that prestigious boards and famous investors conduct proper due diligence, trust that regulatory agencies protect patients. That trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. Every future healthcare startup now faces heightened skepticism because of Theranos. Legitimate innovators pay the price for Elizabeth Holmes's fraud. Elizabeth Holmes is now in her late 30s, serving 11 years in prison. She gave birth to 2 children in the years before and during her trial, a fact that some saw as a calculated move to generate sympathy. Her legal appeals have been largely unsuccessful. She will likely serve most of her sentence. Ramesh Balwani is also imprisoned. Theranos is gone. The Edison devices, which never worked, are relics. The black turtlenecks and the deep voice are remembered as props in a performance. The legacy of Theranos is a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, a warning about valuing story over substance, a warning about the limits of charisma and connections, a warning about what happens when investors don't do diligence, when boards don't provide oversight, when media doesn't ask hard questions, and when founders believe their vision justifies any lie. The story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos is not just about one woman's fraud. It's about the systematic failures that allowed that fraud to flourish, and the lessons we must learn to prevent the next one.